Okay, I am back once again doing what I do on this channel, which is making um, uh, an, a case for papal infallibility and by extension Catholicism, because the Catholic Church is in some sense just that church which is in communion with the successor of St. Peter, the Bishop of Rome. Um, and um, it's really kind of an extended uh, presentation, and it's one broad sort of family of arguments. I can give different aspects or facets of this whole. I can give them different names, but it's all kind of circling around the same thing. But I find the more that I go into depth on this topic, the more I bring out certain critical implications of what are otherwise some seemingly obvious or elementary starting premises. And I really think it's worth delving into. For me, at least, these arguments are dispositive or decisive for Catholicism, and they are completely, well, not maybe perhaps not completely, but in some genuine sense, they are a priori. They don't depend on debates about history or theology. So in this video, I wanted to show how a certain extended thought experiment can sort of fruitfully be used to view the debate as between whether Catholicism is true or every other confession is true, or correct to the extent that it denies something that Catholicism teaches, which papal infallibility would be one, i.e. Catholicism affirms papal infallibility, every other group does not. This thought experiment is one that I presented before, the so-called aircraft manual thought experiment. So some of this is going to be old material, but I just want it to be part of a standalone video. And then part of this is new. So I'm going to get into my slides. Let's open this. Go back to the top. All right, so this is the aircraft manual thought experiment. It is an a priori argument for papal infallibility and therefore for Catholicism. The dedication, as always, is to the Immaculate Heart of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Mother Mary, pray for us. So this is what I'm going to demonstrate. That either papal infallibility is true, or the ability to identify the true church and or the fullness of correct theology depends entirely on the individual's ability to ground every theological judgment in his or her own independently worked out systematic theology, such that he or she cannot rest his or her case on authority, even in part or to some limited extent. Once this is demonstrated, we will also explore its problematic implications for non-Catholicism. And I want to give sort of like the motivation for this essentially a priori argument. When I started to get concerned with the question of which church is the true church, and I started looking on YouTube for videos about it, what I saw was a bunch of people essentially debating theological questions and or historical questions. And I mean, quite apart from anything else, it seems like it would take rather a long time to settle the question based on these sorts of considerations. And in some sense, this discussion has been going on for, I don't know, at least, maybe 1600, 1800 years. or thereabouts, and it still has not brought any kind of final clarity to the question of which church or confession or communion is the correct one. We, if anything, just seem to be getting more and more offshoots and schisms and so forth. Another thing I kind of wonder about is, some predicates are on a complement. So in other words, what it means to be right is not left directionally, so to speak. And Wittgenstein said, if you can't talk about wrong, that means you can't talk about right. And, I kind of wonder about that, because maybe that is true for the purposes of human demonstration, that truth is on its complement. That is to say, even in some sort of, as it were, Eastern or Taoistic sense, truth depends on falsity for its identity. Maybe at least just as far as human demonstration is concerned, or human knowledge is concerned. And why I bring this up is essentially the approach that's taken by everybody else on the internet apparently is, well, I'm going to show that every other church is wrong, and then you'll know that mine is right. And so if this is the reason why the true church is the true church, it does seem to make the truth sort of dependent on a complement in order to be what it is. Yet, if we look at it ontologically instead of epistemologically from our limited viewpoint, if God is the truth and God is not on a complement, he's the ultimate reality, not dependent on anything external or other or opposite for his own identity, then it seems like in an ultimate sense, maybe truth isn't on a complement. And so one wants to know, as it were, the real reason why the true church is the true church, not simply the reason why everybody else is wrong. At a minimum, one can appreciate that the sort of patchwork or piecewise case that every other church is wrong for distinct reasons, because, this church is wrong on this one thing and that church is wrong on that other thing. It's like the least elegant proof imaginable at a minimum. I want to do something more elegant. In other words, in another way to express it is, that patchwork or piecewise case is not the one thing that, if you would know it, it would let you predict that every other church would be wrong. It's not the reason why the true church is the true church in that sense. Whereas the philosopher wants something deeper that is a priori, that is not a posteriori, something that it would have been able to tell you, well, of course all the other churches would have been wrong for some reason or another, because this one church has to be the true church for some reason. And we're gonna delve into that. So before we get into the thought experiment, I need to make clear, at least in some preliminary way, the way in which Catholicism and non-Catholicism map onto the elements, the various elements in the thought experiment. One thing we can appreciate is that, we don't know if papal infallibility is true or not. But if it was true, that would mean that as far as being in the right church, at any/every point in history, one would never actually have needed to use one's own theological judgment. All one would have had to do, and has to do currently, is sort of submit to one's highest ecclesial superior. If we're looking at it from the standpoint of some kind of time-traveling Christian who's beginning from the earliest days, and he's making decisions at every point of schism. If papal infallibility is true, then at every one of these decision points, submitting to your ultimate ecclesial authority or superior without even having to think about the issue will land you in the right church. And let me see, was there something else I was going to say? hold on. Oh yeah, well, and this is why, because for everyone, whether they be Oriental Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, even Martin Luther prior to the Reformation, for everyone at some point or other, basically just before whenever they thought the first error got introduced into the stream of papal teaching, prior to that point for everyone, even though it's a different point for each different group, prior to that point, the Pope was the Bishop of Rome, or the one who's mostly been the Bishop of Rome, was the ultimate ecclesial authority. So if you were just going to submit based on authority rather than using your own judgment on some theological issue or other, the Pope is whom you would submit to. Now you might say, well, the East never believed in universal jurisdiction and never believed in infallibility. That's fine. But it is admitted that the Pope is the head of the church, at least in some purely honorary or nominal sense. The head was not going to be a different person, even if in this purely honorary first among equals sense. He's still, in some nominal sense, the head. And so if you were just going just by authority and saying, I'm not competent to decide anything, I'm just going to submit to my authority, that's the one you would submit to. So that is an important difference between Catholicism and the other churches. Now, of course, the thing is, you just don't necessarily know that papal infallibility is true. You just know what would follow if it was true. And now there is here a temptation also, I suppose. This is a kind of objection that I encounter frequently from non-Catholics. And I think I understand why it's being made, or I should understand, because when I wasn't Catholic, this was the sort of thing I either did say or at least would have said, almost certainly. I don't really remember, but I can very easily see myself jumping to the following line of reasoning. It's like the Rush lyric. If you decide not to use your God-given reason to find out, who's right on the issues, and instead just blindly submit to the ultimate authority, even if he's only the authority in some purely nominal sense. And maybe he's not actually a theological expert for all you know. If you decide not to decide, you've still made a choice. So we're all in the same boat, aren't we? That's kind of the standard response. Now, I want to show how this response actually fails by using the analogy of a Bible verse that many of us might be familiar with, which is Proverbs 3. I said 3:16. It's always different. There's John 3:16, and somehow 3:16 is usually the citation of a notable verse. I meant 3:6. Proverbs 3:6 says that trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, acknowledge him in all your ways, and he will, that's lightning. He will direct your paths. Is that a good sign or not? I hope what I'm doing is pleasing to God. Acknowledge him in all your ways, he will direct your paths. And suppose, and see, this is funny because, like, as an atheist, this is almost certainly what I would have said too. And in fact, maybe I did say it. If someone tells me to submit to God because otherwise I'm just leaning on my own understanding and deciding for myself what's right and wrong, I would say even to make the determination that it's better to submit to God requires me to lean on my own understanding. So there's no way to escape it. You're always making yourself the ultimate authority, even when you submit to another authority. And, this is true. I'm actually not going to deny this. I'm going to concede this objection in principle. But I'm going to note a critical difference, because one way you could interpret Proverbs 3:6 is to say, there is this magical way to submit to an external authority that somehow it avoids all conceivable charges of self-referential inconsistency. It's totally immune to Russell-style paradoxes. That's the point of Proverbs 3:6, which is, of course, not the point at all. But in some sense, the objection assumes that something like that is the point, problematically. But, really, Proverbs 3:6 admits of a different sort of interpretation, which is as follows. Let's say you have some set of issues, X, Y, and Z, and it's you, and there's some kind of authority, some nominal or, supposed authority on the other side of the table, and between you and him on the table is this set of issues, X, Y, and Z. There are two ways one can relate to the authority on the other end of the table. The first is to, when he gives a ruling on issue X, he says, you need to do X and not do Y, or something like that. You can either submit to his judgment and follow his rulings just based on his authority, whether or not you understand his rationale, whether or not he gives you a rationale, whether or not the rationale he gives you makes sense to you. One thing you can do is you can just submit to him based on his authority, and not lean on your own understanding in the sense in which Proverbs 3:6 actually means that expression. And the other way of relating to the authority across the table is to say, well, let me say this before I move on. In the first way of relating to the authority, the submissive way, I am not claiming for a second that the decision to submit to the authority on all of the issues categorically just based on that authority's authority, I am not denying for a second that that is itself a kind of sovereign or unsubmitted decision that presupposes that you have the authority either to judge that he is an authority and or to just, make decisions for yourself concerning how you're going to live, make existential bets of this kind. And so in some meta or second order sense, it's an unsubmitted decision, but in a first order or object level sense, it is a submitted decision. Now, in the second approach, for issues X, Y, and Z, you're not necessarily going to follow the authority on the other side of the table. Maybe if he says go left, I'll go right because I'm my own man, whether or not he's right or whether or not his explanation makes sense to me. Or maybe if he says left, I will go left. If his explanation, if he A, states his reasoning, and B, I find it convincing. And for every issue, I reserve the right to hold up his ruling or his rationale, if he gives one, up to the standard of my own judgment. And if I find it wanting by that standard, I won't obey him. I will lean on my own understanding in this sense, this object level sense, which is, again, I think what Proverbs 3:6 actually means. The difference between these two things is that, let's say these are factual questions. Let's say these are questions of physics or something. And the authority on the other end from you is a respectable physicist, a famous physicist. Now, if you're just Joe Schmo and the guy across the table from you is like Neil deGrasse Tyson or something, you may want to just believe everything he says based on his authority. Why? Because you know that you don't know very much about physics, but he does. All right? Now, the thing of it is, if I submit to Neil deGrasse Tyson, I'm still making a kind of knowledge claim. Well, in this case, A, I'm making the claim that he is an authority. And B, I'm also making the claim that I'm not. I'm claiming to know in some sense that I know nothing. So I recognize there are knowledge claims being made here, but I want to distinguish the kind of knowledge claims that they are from a different kind, which let's say in case B, the person on the other end of the table is Neil deGrasse Tyson, but I am Einstein, time traveling somehow or something. So, if I'm Einstein and the other guy is more or less a physics educator who maybe has done some work, but not the groundbreaking work that I have done, I am not necessarily going to believe everything he says just because he said it. I'm going to subject it to the standard of my own understanding, and it may be appropriate for me to do that. But in that sense, I am leaning on my own understanding, because I am making knowledge claims, not just as to whether or not I know stuff or whether or not the other guy is an expert, but whether or not certain claims in physics are true or false. I'm making knowledge claims to the actual issues of physics on a first order or object level in a way that I'm not in the former case. And so based on this, I want to make it clear that Catholicism and non-Catholicism are not in the same boat, as it were. Because on the one hand, if papal infallibility is true, submitting to the Bishop of Rome does not require actual knowledge of theology to be a principled decision. Rather, if one knows that one doesn't know much theology, that can serve as a principled basis for submission to the Bishop of Rome. Or, if papal infallibility is possibly true, or if there's some reason to believe that it is likely true, something like that. Whereas on non-Catholicism, past a certain point in history, past the point whenever the first papal error was regrettably introduced into the stream of, otherwise previously responsible papal teaching. Past that point, there's nobody that's going to find the true church just leaning on authority. They have to ultimately lean on their own judgment, even if they try to appeal to authority in an approximate sense. And this is what I mean. Every form of Christianity can point to supposed experts or bishops who were wrong on stuff. Nestorius was a bishop, as the saying goes. Every form of Christianity can point to councils that were wrong on stuff. And now every form of non-Catholicism is going to say, well, the head of the church, in whatever, at least in whatever nominal sense, is not right just because he's the head of the church. The head guy is not necessarily right just because he's the head guy. So if the head guy can be wrong, and bishops can be wrong, and councils can be wrong, you know that in theory, any authority can be wrong. So if you are going to say, well, but this so-and-so seems like it's a trustworthy authority, the magisterium of the Eastern Orthodox Church or something, it seems like it's trustworthy. When the question of why do you think that is trustworthy comes up, the answer, if there is a principled basis at all, is always going to actually rest on one's own theological expertise at the object level. Whereas if the question comes up, why do you submit to the Bishop of Rome? One response I can give is, well, I'm the real theological expert, and I fact-checked him on all his claims, and it turns out he's right. So, I think he's trustworthy. But then next year when he says something that goes against my understanding of the magisterium, I become a sede vacantis or something like that. But theoretically that you can do that. And the other way is you can say, well, I don't know that the Pope is necessarily right, But I know that, papal infallibility is either true or it's not true. And I know that if it's not true, everything would rest on one's theological expertise. Not just knowing if you know nothing, but actually knowing the theology. And based on how hard theology actually is, and based on, the faith that God will provide for us in the midst of difficulties or obstacles, that gives me some reason to believe that it would not have all come down to my own theological judgment, but there would be some kind of trustworthy external guide, so that if I know that I know nothing, I can nevertheless trust in God that there will be a sort of lifeline or a trusty external guide outside me that I can grab hold of. And so that this submission to the Bishop of Rome is not based on any kind of claim to have been able to fact check all of his theological positions, at the object level or the first order level of theology. So hopefully that is clear. Now I'm going to talk about the aircraft manual thought experiment. So this thought experiment is one in which there is sort of a reality TV show, and there is a sort of a challenge where the contestants all turn up to a warehouse, 100 or so people, and each of them is given a kit, their own individual kit, out of which each man is to build his own aircraft, following the instructions that come with the kit. The original inspiration for this came from my having watched documentary about Ocean Gate, Stockton Rush, and the CEO of Ocean Gate, Stockton Rush, had built his own aircraft out of a kit, and I thought that's kind of interesting. So that's where the genesis of this idea came from. And but in this case, the thing that you are building is kind of an alien sort of aircraft. It's weird. It is made out of some kind of almost Lego that you can arrange in different ways, and it will snap together, and in different possible configurations, everything will kind of snap together and look like it's the thing is supposed to fit together this way. Sometimes when you're assembling something, you can, even if you don't know what you're doing, you can get a sense of whether the thing is snapping together or not, whether you're doing a credible job or not. But with this strange alien Lego, you do not necessarily have that sense. Moreover, the instructions are very unclear. In the instructions, one can find support for, one version of an aircraft or another version or another version. You don't exactly know how it's telling you to build the aircraft. Nobody on his own really feels like they understand the instructions, with the exception of 9 so-called experts, or who are genuine experts in aeronautics. But nevertheless, because this kind of aircraft is alien and novel and unlike anything previously existing in aeronautics history, their aeronautics expertise doesn't necessarily mean they know what they're doing here. And what this is supposed to map onto is the way in which theology, which is the knowledge of God, and which is the thing that finding the true church comes down to, i.e. the true church is you find it by seeing who's correct on all their theological claims, or at least that's one way you could find it, because the true church is, by definition, it's like the fullness of correct theology. It's correct on all its theology. Theology, God is holy. He's transcendent. He's unlike anything that exists on earth. He has no sort of analog or precedent or earthly phenomenon in terms of which you can reductively understand God. There's nothing like that. So that's the reason why this aircraft, in order to correspond to that reality, is sort of an alien or strange aircraft. But yeah, as I said, there are 9 supposed experts, each of whom feels very confident that he knows what he's doing. And they tell you, you can trust me, and you're one of the contestants. And you have to build this aircraft, and it has to be flight worthy enough that at the end of the challenge, you can fly to Canada in it. Let's say that it's a self-driving sort of aircraft. But there's very little actual margin for errors. So the sort of dangerous thing is that even though this aircraft can seem to hold together in all different possible configurations, there's actually only one way that it is supposed to look. And, there's very little margin for error. If you do not build it the right way, it will not be flight worthy. It will not be safe. And if you fly it to Canada, you will perish in all likelihood. So, you're one of the contestants, and this is the challenge. And the experts are, each expert of these 9 experts is telling you, trust me, I'm reliable because of what I know. I have a PhD in aerodynamics or something, or engineering or whatever. I'm a rocket scientist at NASA, etc. If you follow me, you'll be good because of what I know. Now, the problem is that each of these 9 experts are differing from each other in how they build their aircraft. So you know that 8 of them are wrong, at least. Possibly they're all wrong. And so this is a quandary, because if I'm going to follow one of, I freely admit, I don't understand what's going on in this manual. I would like to follow an expert, but how do I know which of these experts is correct? It seems like, unfortunately, in order to find which one of these experts is correct, I have to rely on my own understanding of the manual. But the fact that I don't understand the manual is sort of the problem that I'm appealing to an external expert to solve. It's a sort of catch-22. So at the end of the day, unfortunately, even though there are these experts, they don't really help me, because assuming that any of them is correct, these are experts that the show brought on, but, assuming that any of them is correct, I only have an 11% or so chance of being right by betting on whomever I bet on. And in the end, it will be sort of a blind bet, because I have that little faith in my ability to understand the manual for myself. Okay. I guess that... Okay. Oh, I'm still explaining the thought experiment. So now, in addition to these 9 experts, though, there is a 10th quasi-expert, a 10th person, about whom there is a rumor, or who himself makes a claim that but it's not necessarily officially endorsed by the producers of the show in an obvious way, that this person claims that he knows the inventor of the aircraft, and that he and the inventor of the aircraft have a relationship where if this 10th person builds his aircraft wrong in any way, he's not necessarily more knowledgeable about the aircraft than anybody else, but he has a special relationship with the inventor of the aircraft, the only real expert on it, the only one who knows with certainty how it's actually supposed to all fit together. He has a relationship with the inventor, such that if he, the 10th person, ever builds his aircraft wrong in any particular respect, he sort of gets a buzz on his pager that only he can sense, his pager vibrates or something, and it just keeps vibrating until he fixes the mistake. So theoretically, this person can produce an error-free aircraft with certainty if he is if the rumor is true. But the problem is that it's kind of just a rumor. You don't necessarily know if it's true. And so basically, there's a lot of factionalism happening in this reality TV show challenge. The partisans of expert number one are very sure that expert number one is correct, to the point where they are in shouting matches with the partisans of experts, 2 and 3 and 4, etc. Maybe it even almost comes to blows, as indeed theological disputes have often come to blows, in history. And then there's like, you've got your friend on the TV show challenge with you, and you're like talking to your friend, you're saying, how are we going to do this? This is actually so hard to do, because to decide which expert is correct, it's like we already have to be experts ourselves on the manual. And, you come to the conclusion that, well, I don't know if the rumor is true, but I do know that it's either true or not true. And I know that if it's not true, it's as if the producers all expected us to be able to decipher this confusing manual so well that we could each build the aircraft identically and safely. But that's just not the reality of our ability to understand the manual, and they would have known that. So therefore, to the extent that I can trust that the producers actually want us to be able to survive this challenge, the rumor must be true. And now basically your friend is going to try to talk you out of this position using various objections. They're basically different objections one can make to the previous argument that I made for Catholicism. And I'm just going to translate them into AMTE terms, aircraft manual thought experiment terms. I'm going to translate them into AMTE terms as a kind of extended thought experiment, which I think lets us fruitfully look at the question. It's like a useful model. So we already discussed, as it were, the zeroth objection, which is that everybody is in the same boat. But this really does come up a lot. So in AMTE terms, it would be as if your friend said that, even if you decide that this 10th man is correct and the rumor is true, that's still coming down to your knowledge of the manual, because you're saying that, well, I know the 10th man is true because I can tell from the manual that he's building it right. And you would tell your friend, no. I mean, one could follow the 10th man for that reason, because you're following the manual yourself, and all of his decisions happen to line up with yours, in which case you're not even really submitting to him based on his authority or based on the probability that the rumor is true about him, but rather you're actually just agreeing with him to the extent that he actually just agrees with you. You're submitting to yourself only on the object level as well as on the meta level. But that's one way you could do it. You concede to your friend, but that's not what I'm doing. I'm making an argument from my own ignorance. I know that I know nothing, but I know the producers want us to have a shot at doing this. Therefore, the rumor has to be true. Because otherwise, we only have at best an 11% chance of being right, assuming any of the other experts are right. So that is the response to the kind of, as it were, zeroth objection. But there are 4 more that can come after that, and that will tend to arise. So the second one, this is really the critical one, actually. I think it will become evident in the course of this demonstration that on an a priori level, Catholicism, or really papal infallibility, has everything going for it. And the only thing that can spoil the show is if it just turns out that Catholicism is incoherent or factually wrong on some theological and or historical claim. The secret is buried in the proceedings of the 9th Ecumenical Council or something. And once you understand what happened there, then you will know that even if papal infallibility is this thing that it would be really convenient to believe, it can't be believed on sort of empirical or a posteriori grounds. These will all really amount to a claim, a technical claim. A claim that Catholicism is wrong on the facts. however nice it might be, however nice a fiction it might be to believe in principle. So it would, in AMTE terms, be as if your friend said, "Oh, okay, I see what you're saying about the 10th man now. You can follow him because you claim to just know that you know nothing. But I can tell from my knowledge of the manual that he happens to be building his aircraft wrong. I agree with you, my friend, that it would be a beautiful thing if this rumor were true. But unfortunately, I can just tell from the manual that he's building it wrong." Now, what's the problem with this? Obviously, it's as if your friend is now setting himself up as an expert. He is in real world terms, this is like disagreeing with Catholicism, not because you're Eastern Orthodox or something, but because based on your own independently worked out systematic theology, Catholicism is wrong in one or more ways. And so that is presupposing that you are competent to determine either the fullness of correct theology based on your own authority and nobody else's, or something close enough to the fullness that it can rule out Catholicism as a possible candidate for being itself the fullness of correct theology. And, as we're going to explore, there's the critical central issue, or one of them is, with this, is not just whether it's technically feasible, which is already somewhat doubtful. Like, is anybody really going to have figured out the Trinity on their own from some limited set of givens? Because it appears that the church fathers before Nicaea weren't explicitly verbalizing or writing down their belief in the doctrine of the Trinity. They seemed functionally, at least, or as far as their language can reasonably be construed, they were more like subordinationists, not necessarily holding that the Son and the Spirit are co-eternal and co-equal with the Father, but they sort of see the Father as in the first place, the Son in the second place, and the Spirit in the third place, in a way that sort of maps onto maybe a Platonic or Neoplatonic philosophy that existed at the time, or certainly to one that existed later, like in the writings of Plotinus. If I'm right about whenever Plotinus wrote, I might be wrong, but so they almost spoke of like a second God, or the logos as a kind of activity of God, but it wasn't on the same level of divinity as God, or at least that was sort of a prevailing idea in that intellectual climate at the time, and the way that the earliest church fathers wrote about the Trinity, as it would later be called, by Tertullian, the first one to use that term, and he himself doesn't speak about it in what would today be considered acceptably orthodox ways. This is the way that the church fathers sort of wrote on this subject prior to Nicaea, in what appear to be functionally subordinationist terms. And so if they couldn't do it, like, how to put it, you can say, you can't really call BS on my claim to be able to have derived the doctrine of the Trinity, that God is three hypostases and one ousia, from my own independently worked out systematic theology, because what? Does either of us have a time machine? I can't actually go back and see if I would have been able to be right on the Trinity. To echo Chris Hitchens a little bit, we can answer this question as if it were not hypothetical. We know the church fathers were in that position, and nobody seems to have taught it explicitly prior to Nicaea, and even arguably during Nicaea. Nicaea does say that if anyone says the Father and the Son differ in hypostasis, let him be anathema, which is, of course, the whole idea behind the Trinity. But the wrinkle there is that it seems like hypostasis can sometimes take on the same meaning as ousia. Hold on, I gotta check my connection here. It seems like hypostasis can actually have a similar or identical meaning to ousia or substance. Like it can mean the same thing as the substance of a thing rather than an exemplar of some substance. So maybe the sense in which the fathers meant it is like just in the same sense of ousia. Whereas, if you disambiguate, it's not in contradiction with later Trinitarian teaching. I can appreciate that. But the thing is that from the way they're writing, we can tell it's not like they're exactly yet conceiving it in the sort of positive terms that we classically associate with the doctrine. It's maybe like still negative, like a hedge around the truth. Like my friend Sam from the Transfigured channel holds that there were not any true Trinitarians at Nicaea. I'm not sure I can verify that for myself, but it does look like everybody who wrote about it, from that time period was describing it in functionally subordinationist terms, including Tertullian, who introduced the term Trinity. And so, that's the kind of an argument for why it wouldn't be technically feasible to try to ground everything in your own independently worked out systematic theology without appealing to any authority whatsoever on any issue. But that's not even really the biggest problem as I see it. The biggest problem is that, it's common to acknowledge a distinction between general revelation and special revelation. And the sort of difference between the two is that general revelation you can figure out from your own reason, like Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways or something. Yeah, there's got to be a first cause, and this all men speak of as God, but there is sort of like, but which God? Is it really the God of Islam? Is it the God of Christianity? Which this whole thing is presented from a Christian standpoint. It's making the assumption that Christianity is true. Why do I just get to assume that? Well, technically I don't, but what I'm saying is, if it's not true, then the question of which church is the true church is no longer very important. So I'm just, for the sake of having this discussion, at the very least, I'm assuming the truth of Christianity. But, like, which God is it and what's he like? Does he actually care about us? Is it actually some kind of weird impersonal ultimate reality that doesn't care about us any more than we care about ants? Who knows? So to know who God really is in his character, it's like special revelation. But now the question is special revelation open and tractable to human reason in the same way as general revelation? And really, consistently, all Christian theologians have answered no, and all major denominations of Christianity have answered no. And there's this idea that God is personal. He's sovereign. He's living. All you can intellectually figure out about him is that he cannot be intellectually figured out. And that as far as the particularities of the living God, his name that he gives to Moses in Exodus, for example, his own actual name, and his quirks, as it were, these are things that that he is in fact actually 3 persons in one being from a Christian standpoint. These are things that we would never have a hope of understanding just based on our own reason, that in order to understand them, we are totally at the mercy of God's own self-disclosure. Now that raises the question, well, if we're totally at the mercy of God's own self-disclosure because he's a someone rather than a something, he's not this finite, tractable subject that you can just tease out the implications of if you're smart enough in this law-like way, like geometry. I mean, of course, there is a sense in which geometry is not finite. It is infinite, but in some sense it is finite insofar as it is a definite subject defined apart from other subjects, and it itself does not encompass the totality of reality. It's not like the ultimate reality or anything like that. It's a facet of reality, something like that. And So God is not a finite and tractable subject like geometry, but he is a someone. And in order to know, again, the special revelation truths about him, you are totally at the mercy of his own self-disclosure, that he can either sovereignly choose to provide or not provide. And, this is how most Christians would think, it seems to me. But the question is, what does that mean in practice for us? What it seems to mean is that we have to submit to the authority of the sources of his revelation, to the extent that his revelation is something public / objective / something that multiple parties can participate within, something that admits of intersubjective agreement or sort of interoperability. To that extent, it has to take the form of some kind of public authority. But now, whether that authority that everyone in the public space can look to, but whether that authority is like a book, or if it's 7 councils plus a book, or if it's 7 councils plus a book plus a particular episcopaliate or bishop college, or it's the book plus councils plus a bishop college plus the head guy, the pope. That everyone's account of that is going to differ, but there is the idea, like, even in the most minimalist forms of Christianity that are typically Protestant, it's like, well, you can't know about God based on your reason. You're totally at the mercy of his own self-disclosure, which means rather than try to figure him out in your head, you must submit to the authority of the Bible. That's the only hope you've got. And so the problem with claiming to be able to ground everything in your own independently worked out systematic theology and not being able to rest anything on an authority is that it seems to imply that God is a something rather than a someone. There is a different step one can make here, which is to say, well, my stance toward God is relational, but it's immediate. It's not mediated by any public authority structure. But see, then what you have is a situation where the only way I know that I'm on the right track and the next guy is on the wrong track is if, I don't know, I assume that I'm holier than he is or something, so I know that I have better reason to believe than he does, that the subjective sense of inner knowing that I feel is actually veridical in my case, and the subjective sense of inner knowing that he feels is not true in his case. Maybe it's that way. Generally, though, holy people don't claim to be holier than others or see themselves that way. Whoever would be first would be last. For the problems with this, you can see I go into greater depth on this in previous videos. But, there is that problem. Even if I try to say, well, I know my church is right because my church has holier people than his church. If he says, no, my church has holier people than your church, what is your claim to superior competence in being able to judge the holiness of others come down to? If not some implicit claim about your own greater personal holiness? There are issues here. But fundamentally, it's also and I go into greater depth, like I said, on these issues in other videos. I want to say part 6 or 7 of the theological difficulty series. There's that, but there's also just the way that there's the truth in what Wittgenstein said, where unless you can talk about wrong, you can't talk about right, at least for the purposes of human demonstration. In other words, I'm not really ever going to know that I'm right unless I can really know that the other guy is wrong. But the only way I would ever know the other guy is wrong is if I had access to his own subjective feelings, which by definition I can't access to see if the subjective sense of his inner knowing is greater or otherwise more trustworthy or veridical than mine. It's making it so that theology is no longer this thing where we can talk about there being one correct, objective, church or true church or fullness of correct theology. And, you might say, well, maybe there is none. And that is something that I am not claiming to know is not true. There are good reasons to believe it's true, which I've talked about in other videos, but I'm not claiming to know that it's not true. Or certainly I am acknowledging there's a powerful sense in which it is true. In other words, like theological details are like the letter of the law, but your heart toward God is the spirit of the law, that true theology is like really, in a certain sense, only useful to the extent that it serves that end or brings you closer to God in a humble rather than a puffed up way. I acknowledge that. But here's the thing. For the purposes of this discussion, we've got to assume there's one correct, objective, true church. Because if we don't assume that, it's not really worth having this discussion. It's the same thing like with Christianity. So, but to say that, well, I'm not saying God is a something. I'm saying he's a someone. My stance toward him is relational, but it's immediate rather than mediated. That seems to make it so that we can no longer actually meaningfully talk about there being one sort of correct, objective, true church. So it's what it is we have to be able to acknowledge some authority. But the problem is, if you deny papal infallibility, but you would attempt to submit to some other authority, the question is, on what grounds do you believe that authority is trustworthy? It always is going to reduce to some kind of, it's resting on your own judgment as far as the facts. I know that my decision to submit to the Pope because I don't know the facts is also resting on my own judgment, but it's not resting on my claimed knowledge of the facts, only on my knowledge that I do not know the facts. And that is a very critical distinction. One can see from this that basically the harder theology is, in the same way that, because if the manual were very simple, no one would have to trouble themselves over whether the rumor was true or not. There would not be as much motivation to believe that it was true. And similarly, if theology were very easy, as some folks kind of treat it like it is, but it's not really, because of what I called the minimal fact set problem in previous presentations, where they're not this one set of articulated facts that everybody who is in good faith who looks at it just acknowledges the clear directionality of those facts, or the clear ecclesiological implication or entailment of those facts. Because it'd be that, for any kind of case that's out there, or collection of facts that you can name, everyone who looks at it and at least claims to have awareness of what all facts are involved, people who are very smart and who are all in good faith, presumably. I mean, if we presume anyone who disagrees with us is in bad faith, that's another stance. It's just not realistic to me, though. It is the case. It doesn't appear to be the case that there's some kind of minimal fact set that everyone who looks at it will just, in good faith, agree on its objective, neutral entailment, such that one church is decisively indicated over all the others on this kind of object level or first order theological basis. There doesn't seem to be anything like that. So in other words, whatever theology is, whether or not you can find the true church based on sort of object level or first order theological reasoning, it's in all likelihood it's not very easy to do so. So the more difficult theology is, the more that is increasing the motivation to believe in papal infallibility, due to this critical distinction between sort of claiming to have object level knowledge of theology and only claiming to have meta level knowledge of one's ignorance of theology. Although I will admit that this increases the motivation for papal infallibility, but it doesn't cinch it, not by itself. You sort of have to consider other things. So with this having been said, I want to come back to the slides. And I'm going to open my slideshow. So I already covered it's technically wrong. And you can go more on this. In some sense, it deserves more treatment. But you see, if somebody says, well, I'm sure I can trust the Eastern Orthodox authority. I don't accept papal infallibility, but I don't also claim to be able to ground everything in my own IWAST, my own independently worked out systematic theology either. I get all my facts from the Eastern Orthodox authority, and my question is, why do you believe that they're a reliable authority? And I can either try to prop it up with specific object level claims about theology, which seems to negate my earlier claim that I'm not basing it all on my own independently worked out systematic theology. Or I can say something to the effect that, well, at a minimum, some one of the existing options must be right. So I at least have a good chance of being right. And they're really just my best guess. They look the most convincing to me. It's because, like, I have the sense of everything snapping together when I look at things from an Eastern Orthodox point of view. I know I'm right on the theology because the authority backs me up. I know the authority is trustworthy because I know I'm right on the theology. In AMTE terms, we can see that this kind of claim is unfortunately circular. It would be as if your friend said, no, the rumor cannot be correct about the 10th man. I know this because expert number 9 is actually correct. And then I ask my friend, how do you know that expert number 9 is correct? Oh, because of my reading of the manual. And I know that I'm reading it the right way. And I ask him, well, how do you know that you're reading it the right way? And he tells me, well, because expert number 9 assures me that I do. And so that's obviously circular. But if he says, well, look, I have the sense that when I follow expert number 9, everything makes sense to me. My aircraft is all snapping together. And that's just not the case for anybody else. But everybody else does appear to at least have the same subjective sense, whether or not my friend is right and they're wrong. Just the way that, people may speak of going to an Eastern Orthodox church and sort of catching the phronema of the church, and then sort of theology sort of opening up and making sense to them, but only from that, ecclesiological viewpoint. And I get that. That's a real thing. But, Dominican monks who study Thomist theology often speak and act that way. And anyone who really follows like a system-based theology, not that I'm claiming Eastern Orthodoxy is one, but and for the purposes of this standalone video, let me explain. I'm kind of using Eastern Orthodoxy as like just a standard go-to example, but also like deliberately because there's a way that a lot of the energy online has interestingly shifted toward Eastern Orthodoxy, and it's sort of to me like the runner-up, the next most convincing option, perhaps because it is closer to Catholicism than any of the other options, at least in certain respects. Anyway, so I'm not claiming that Eastern Orthodox theology is particularly systematic, and that's what I'm saying. It's not what I'm saying, but I am observing that this is especially true among the more system-based theologies like Calvinism, Tulip, Reformed theology, or dispensationalist theology, which is quite different, but it's also kind of systematic. People often have the sense of everything snapping together once they look at theology through these lenses. But of course, the key point here is that unfortunately, all these approaches are mutually exclusive. And so merely that sense of having a subjective sense of certainty is not going to let us validly discriminate among these different candidates, not in a principled way. There are things where, like, I know that the Eastern Orthodox apologist Jay Dyer, who's tremendously knowledgeable and very good at debating, says that, he inclines toward the presuppositionalist view, that in my view correctly observes that every epistemic viewpoint is ultimately circular. And so the real test is just like how self-consistent your theology actually is. And he believes Eastern Orthodox theology is the most self-consistent, and so on. The only thing is, I agree that every epistemic viewpoint is ultimately going to be circular, at least, as far as we're concerned, as my friend Mitch likes to say. The thing is, we can't just accept any old argument because it's circular. It's not like circularity is a virtue. In fact, I think the more you look at it, the more you understand it as a kind of necessary evil. That all else equal, circularity is not a good thing. That if we have a choice between two different circular perspectives, we're ultimately going to choose the one that is more comprehensive, that can explain more of the facts, and this can be the only principled basis for selecting among perspectives where all of them are acknowledged to be ultimately circular. And so in this case, and that sort of notion I learned from the autodidact philosopher Christopher Langan. You do not have to agree with his views, because I don't either, because I'm Catholic. So I believe in what the Catholic Church teaches, but I'm not going to deny his brilliance either. And he got, in my view, he's correct to say that everything, that there is a sort of necessary circularity to, like, even the ultimate epistemological viewpoint. And he's the one that really schooled me on things like that. And so I don't know him personally, but I've read his writing. This is what gave me the idea that comprehensiveness is really the criterion that lets you sort among different circular perspectives. And the example of that here, of why my perspective is more comprehensive, is that so let's say Jay Dyer's perspective doesn't explain as much of the data as mine, because my data explains this sort of double dissociation of, like, well, there are some catechumens who initially caught the phronema and everything seemed to make sense to them, but then they left because they became convinced that the filioque is true, for example. Like Ben Bollinger is an example of this, and there are others, like the YouTuber who calls himself the Cathodox. And there are also people in different systems that are not compatible with Eastern Orthodoxy who claim this kind of sense of everything snapping together. And for them, it feels like everything fits together better on this view. What's my explanation for these data? It's that theology is so hard that it's not always even necessarily going to feel like it's hard. Might feel like it's easy and everything's fitting together when in fact you're disastrously wrong. Actually, I would submit that if you really would go deeply into any of these perspectives, there will always be at least some kind of formal level where your position, even though it's not correct, will sort of sympathetically resonate with the truth or rhyme with it. But nonetheless, like on a formal level somehow, but nonetheless on a content level, it's not correct. And somebody who goes deeply into Calvinist theology may gain an appreciation of the sovereignty of God, even if he's technically wrong, assuming Calvinism is wrong, that someone in another tradition might not appreciate as equally, even though this is like a real feature of theological reality or of God's reality. So all else equal, the system that you can't tell if you're winning at it or losing at it, where you could be losing at it and feel like you're winning. That's a harder system to understand than the system that you have this reliable intuitive feedback on whether you're doing it right or not, so that even if you don't know how to do it right, you at least can tell you're doing it wrong when you're doing it wrong. All else equal, between these two kinds of systems, the former is more difficult. And I'm saying theology is this kind of system. And that's why we have these double dissociative data. So that if your criteria for choosing among different circular views is, well, you should choose one that offers you a subjective sense of things snapping together and it being more self-consistent. Unfortunately, based on these criteria, multiple positions seem open, and you don't seem to have a principled basis for choosing one over another. And you need a principled basis, because of the principle of sufficient reason, which says everything needs to have a reason. The reason why this is a powerful sort of consideration is that if you would question the principle of sufficient reason and question whether it is necessarily true, it's like saying, well, why should I assume the principle of sufficient reason is true? It's presupposing the principle of sufficient reason in as much as it is presupposing that there is a reason for the principle of sufficient reason. So it's not the sort of consideration that one can critique without actually assuming it in the first place. That makes it powerful on a logical level. So there needs to be a principled basis for sorting among different perspectives. And I would say that the superior comprehensiveness of my position is that principled basis that lets you choose it validly, as opposed to the Eastern Orthodox position or the dispensationalist position or the Calvinist position, etc. Now, of course, Jay Dyer can claim that I'm saying mine is more comprehensive, but the Eastern Orthodox position is actually correct on the facts. And, my question is, how do you know that? Is there anything in your approach that you're actually just taking on authority and not grounding in your own independently worked out systematic theology? If so, why should I believe that authority is trustworthy? To say something like, well, surely at least one of them must be trustworthy, because otherwise, it would be too difficult to find the true church or something? In the abstract, if this is the only reason supplied, first of all, it doesn't necessarily mean your position is correct, but it also seems to force us to favor papal infallibility, all other things being equal. So this can't be the sort of grounding for it. So what is it grounded on? Is it grounded in your own independently worked out systematic theology? If you say yes, it's like it's all grounded in that, and you're claiming God as a something rather than a someone almost. But if you say no, then it rests on nothing. It's unprincipled. So I have kind of at this point come to realize that the real logic of non-Catholicism is to acknowledge the circularity and the thorniness of theology, but to say that we're all in the same boat, though. Because even if you decide not to decide, you still made a choice. And even if you become Catholic, it's just because of your own leaning on your own theological understanding that the papacy is true. But as we already discovered or discussed, that it's actually not that way. But in order for non-Catholicism to really work and make sense, it has to assume that it is that way. But once you discover that it's not that way, then that's kind of the death knell, in my opinion, for any alternative position. Let's keep on going to other objections. My friend in the reality TV show Challenge might say, well, you know what? Okay. I admit that I don't really understand this manual very well. I can't necessarily trust any of the experts. But I don't think that just because we're going to fail if we're left to our own devices, that means the rumor is true. I think what's going to happen is at the end, they're not going to let us fly to Canada in a defective aircraft. They're not going to let anybody fly. They'll just grade us all on a curve based on who actually got closest. And whoever got closest will win the challenge. And so this sort of objection is sort of doing a couple things. One, it's missing the sense in which there may be some intrinsic or positive motivation to do this task rather than a merely negative one of wanting to avoid error. Like maybe it's really fun to fly to Canada in this thing. So we are missing out if that's just how it is. But B, let me see. Well, I would almost think it makes theology not matter, but maybe it does because it's still rank ordering each contestant's work strictly, grading in what's the word I want? They're grading everyone according to like a rank or a hierarchy, right? And but the problem is that in order to know that the rumor is false, it seems like you have to actually ground your objection in your own independently worked out systematic theology, which maybe even if it's not technically feasible to be right about everything, maybe it's more plausibly technically feasible to be right about enough to know that the rumor is wrong, even if you don't know the fullness. And so you will be the one who is right when everyone's graded on a curve, even though you're not right on everything. You know, that's conceivable. But again, to me, it does seem to make God a something rather than a someone. And that by itself seems rather problematic. But, you know, here's the catch is that if you admit that he's a someone rather than a something, and that, you know, an independently worked out systematic theology has basically zero chance of, almost no chance of actually lining up with the truth, although it's like if you're a blind dart thrower throwing at a dartboard somewhere in a circular room around you, you're not sure that you're going to miss. All you're really sure of is that you're blind, but you're pretty darn sure you're not going to hit the thing. So I think when we acknowledge that God is a someone rather than a something, that to the extent that we are trying to intellectually figure him out rather than submit to an authority, a public authority, rather than submit to his own self-disclosure in the form of a public authority, we're theologically blind. Now, where everyone is in the same boat, it would just say, well, you're theologically blind too. We're all theologically blind, so this is all the best we can do, even though we don't have very much chance of being right. But as we discussed, it's actually not that way. And so, there is a way that if we admit the theological blindness, then we have no actual reason to believe the rumor is false, because we only really have a reason to believe the rumor is false to the extent that we can offer a technical critique. But to the extent that we acknowledge ourselves theologically blind or incapable of understanding the manual, to that extent we acknowledge ourselves incapable of offering such a reliable technical critique. It would be like if I was in the competition and you said, what do you think the manual is saying? To me, it's saying you should build the aircraft a certain way. It looks like this. And I call it version A. But I know I don't understand the manual hardly at all. So when the show producers bring out the person whom they call the inventor of the aircraft, and the inventor wheels out his own version of it that looks different from mine, let's call that version B, I'm not going to hesitate to switch and say, you know what? I think version B is the correct way. Even though version A really does represent my own best guess as to what the manual is saying. how can you switch your guess? You just said this is version A is what you think the manual is saying. Well, yes, it is what I think the manual is saying, but I don't have a very high assessment of my competence to understand the manual. And because that is logically prior, the judgment of whether I'm qualified to understand the manual is logically prior to the question of in which direction the manual happens to point or how it says the aircraft should be built. That means that, if my self-assessment of my qualification or competence is very low, then yes, version A is my best guess as to what the manual says, but my best guess isn't anything more than a hill of beans. So maybe the way the rumored man is building his aircraft doesn't look right to me based on my own read of the manual. And maybe they are just grading us on a curve. So that even if I don't build everything right, if I just know that he's wrong, I'll do well. Well, the only issue is I can't really rule out the truth of him being true based on my own knowledge of the manual, because I acknowledge I don't know actually anything about the manual. So it actually makes more sense to believe the rumor is true to the extent that you think the producers will have provided a way for you to do this thing right, even where you don't understand the manual very well. Which, of course, brings us to the fourth objection, where my friend can say, okay, I see your case for believing in the rumor. It does look like if it's not true, then it all rests on our own understanding. Sure, but just because if it's not true, it all rests on our own ability to understand the manual, doesn't mean that it is true, because it's making this very critical assumption that the producers will have provided a way for us to get out of here. Whereas you don't know that. What if they're malicious? You don't know that. I mean, I can't rule it out, but you don't know that it's true either. This kind of thing. So the logic here, though, is, again, to the extent that you are not competent enough to rule out the rumor's truth on technical grounds, even if it is true, there's no way to actually get out of here, or even if it's true that possibly the producers haven't given us any way out. I mean, if they've definitely given us a way out and we know that we don't know the manual, then the rumor has to be true. But maybe we don't know actually that they have given us a way out. But to the extent that we are blind theologically, to the extent that we don't understand the manual, it still makes sense to go with whatever the rumored man is doing. Because part of being totally blind, like the blind dart thrower, is like every direction I turn from, as far as I'm concerned, it has an equal chance of being right. An equally low chance, but an equal chance. So what that means is I have no principled basis on which to choose one direction rather than another. It's not so much that I know I'm going to be wrong, it's just that there's not really a relationship between the effort I put into the endeavor and the accuracy of my resultant guess. And so in a similar way, to the extent that I acknowledge myself incompetent to understand the contents of the manual, I don't, it's like the rumored man has as much chance of being right as anybody else, as any of the other experts, or including myself. So if there is any chance that the producers made us a way to get out of here, it makes more sense to copy the rumored man, because I get whatever random chance goes along with his being right, plus, maybe just by chance, even though the rumor's false, he's building it correctly according to the manual or whatever. I get that chance plus whatever chance the rumor actually has of being true, which even if you would claim, well, I don't know for certain. See, look, papal infallibility is implying, or seems to imply, God is providentially intervening in certain ways in order to keep the church on keel. It's not saying he's inspiring the popes as much as it's saying that the pope is divinely safeguarded from ever binding the faithful to error. It's a kind of negative protection, but it does seem to imply that God is sort of intervening providentially. And I gave examples of that earlier in the theological difficulty series. And it's logically possible for God to do this. It's not like a square circle, but it's not every good thing that God could do that he does in fact do. Like, it's also logically possible for him to just get rid of cancer right now. But he hasn't done that. It would be a good thing if he would do that. It's not like God likes cancer, but God works in mysterious ways. And so the limiting factor is whether he is willing to do it. And he is apparently not willing to do it, because he is able to do it, so that if he were willing also to do it, then it would be done, but it's not been done. So we know he's not willing, even though he is able to do this, because he's omnipotent, and the thing in question is not logically incoherent like a square circle. So, let me see, hold on. Just take a little break here. So, your friend is correct in what he's saying, that, it might be nice to believe that the rumor is true. It might be acknowledged that, all else equal, in the abstract, it were better if papal infallibility is true. It's not like the Pope's falling from grace whenever he did, whenever your tradition says he did, was part of God's positive will. Maybe it's just part of his permissive will, the same way that cancer is. And he's going to still, in some mysterious way, bring good out of it, the way that in Genesis, Jacob says, what you meant for evil, he meant for good. It's not every good thing God can do that he does do. But my point is that, to the extent that you acknowledge yourself theologically blind or technically blind in AMTE terms, there's not actually really a good reason not to act as if the rumor is true. There's only upside to it. There's no real downside. So again, the only way you would invalidate it is through a technical critique. But that technical critique either does not rest on any external authority. It rests entirely on you, which is, A, it's not likely you would have been right on everything, and B, it also, like, if you could be reliably correct on something like that, it would seem to make God a something rather than a someone. If it does rest on some external authority, there doesn't actually seem to be any non-circular way to prop that authority up. It seems like the only way you can really submit to an authority, it's like, how to put it? It's been evident to me for some time that the only way to rest your Christian faith on authority in a principled or consistent way is to be Catholic. But what I didn't really appreciate until recently is that unless you can rest your faith on authority in a principled and consistent way, like all the way, as it were, it turns out you actually can't do it at all. Because any other authority that you would want to submit to, you either submit to for no reason, or you just sort of prop it up based on your own implicit expertise. And when you're called out on that, the most you can really say is, well, we're all in the same boat. You have to do that too, whether you like it or not. But as we've seen, that's actually not true. So, here's the last one. I haven't thought about this very much, but like, I don't even know how I would do it in AMTE terms. I guess I can think of it on the fly, but someone can just say, well, doesn't it look like I can make a cumulative case for, I don't know, Eastern Orthodoxy again? Dr. Sijuwade writes this very well written paper about, criteria of continuity, between institutions at the level of organization and aims, and that in Dr. Sijuwade's opinion, the Eastern Orthodox Church most closely resembles the Church of the Council of Nicaea, that gives us the 4 marks by which we sort of canonically recognize the true church, that it be one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Catholic in the lower C sense of just universal. And it's like, well, maybe this isn't necessarily correct. It's not necessarily true that the true church does resemble the Church of Nicaea most closely according to these sort of Swinburnian criteria. But all else equal, it seems like this has, some positive probability associated with it. And therefore that, if you take this fact in combination with other facts that seem to bode well for Eastern Orthodoxy, you can make like this cumulative case. I mean, the issue here is it seems like you can kind of do this with every other church too. And in the end, it just doesn't seem any different from claiming to have worked to the extent that you say, no, my case is decisive over and against the other cases. It just seems like you're setting yourself up as this theological expert who's grounded everything in his own independently worked out systematic theology, which is fine to do. Maybe you just got to use your brain as much as possible if it turns out that everybody's in the same boat. But not everybody's actually in the same boat. Or put it like this. It's not necessarily the case that I am in the same boat as you, and to the extent that that boat is actually leaky, I'm not going to put myself in it. I'm going to put myself in a different boat. I'm going to bet on my own ignorance rather than on my own positive knowledge of object level theology. So, I mean, I guess it would just be like your friend saying like, well, doesn't it really look like this part of the manual is saying this? And doesn't it really look like this other part of the manual is saying that? Heedless to the way in which the same case could be made for any other version of the aircraft. In the end, he's just trying to convince you based on his own independently worked out systematic technical hypothesis or something like that. And so... No. Let me see. You know what? Testing. Okay. You know what? I just finished recording, but I realized I ignored a critical objection, so I'm going to tack this on to the end, hopefully. God willing. I don't think I need my slides. One thing your friend could say is, well, it turns out that this thing, it'll fly anyway, and or none of us are actually flying in it, so it doesn't matter how well we do. The level of precision, essentially the level of precision needed for the model to fly is in fact very low. So there's two ways this can be meant. One is like it is a technical claim. You're saying that this aircraft, it looks like it can fit together a lot of different ways because actually it can. The level of precision you need to make it flyable or flight worthy is actually not very high at all. So like that would seem to be stating that as a technical claim, okay? And once again, like as a technical claim, it is coming down to your own ability to understand the manual and ground everything in your own independent understanding of the manual, which is like the chief aim of this demonstration, just to demonstrate that much, whether or not or to what extent that actually turns out to be technically feasible. Now, there's another sense in which you can mean this, which is in AMTE terms, which is that, there is only one way it can fly. It has to be built the right way for it to fly, and it's very little margin of error and all that. However, at the end, they're not actually going to make us fly, and they're not even going to judge us all that much. And it's going to be pass-fail. It's not going to be on a curve, and everybody who just makes it, with these three basic features, which is most of us, is going to get a passing grade. And so the only thing is... this doesn't really offer you a basis to assume that the rumor is not true. It's kind of like in the blind dart thrower example, where if the dart thrower thinks he's trying to hit a very narrow and small dartboard, but it turns out actually the dartboard is as large as the whole room, more or less. It's all over the wall. It's wrapped all around the wall. Like you can hardly miss that thing. Then you know, it turns out he doesn't have really anything much to worry about. But in the dart thrower example, the equivalent of the rumor being true was, before the blind dart thrower throws his dart, he is spun around by somebody else. He's turned around and around, like before you're going to hit a piñata. And he has to, the rumor is basically that person spinning him is trying to help him, and he will leave him facing, he will face him in the right direction toward the dartboard, let's say, okay? And but he doesn't know if that's true. But so long as he doesn't have any particular reason to doubt that it's true, it's like he might as well throw in that direction, because he gets whatever original random chance there was, plus the chance that the rumor is true, something like that. And so if it turns out that, well, actually the dartboard is so big, it's you can hardly miss the thing, there's no downside to just assuming the rumor is true and throwing in the direction that you've been faced. Unless, again, the claim is the essentially technical claim that I know enough to know that on technical grounds the rumor/papal infallibility must be false, however nice it would be to believe if it were true. And that, again, is forcing you to ground ultimately everything in your own independently worked out systematic theology. Because to the extent that you acknowledge yourself to be theologically blind, there's no downside to throwing straight ahead or assuming that the rumor is true, building your aircraft after the aircraft of the rumored man, or, assuming that papal infallibility is true. Maybe I covered that, maybe not, but I'm going to tack this on at the end just to be safe. All right. Awesome. Peace out. I think this is pretty much all I was going to cover in this presentation. It's not, in a certain sense, it's still not a slam dunk. There is the possibility that, well, maybe I don't have to say God is a something, but there is a way that you can actually figure it all out based on your own reason. And maybe most people aren't smart enough, because look, if Catholicism is not true, then at a minimum that theology is at least this hard that most people are wrong on it. But maybe most people can't do it, but I can certainly do it. It may be hard for most people, but it's not necessarily hard for me to ground it all in my own eyewash. So I think it's technically feasible for me to do this. And in the end, you're just going to basically balance. You're going to weigh the likelihood that you can ground everything in your own eyewash against the likelihood that the rumor is true, and it's sort of whichever one comes up higher is more or less what you're going to choose. And so if you consider yourself very smart, and you have some valid grounds to do so, like my friend Sam is incredibly smart. He's like a Harvard-educated statistician. It might not be so ridiculous to claim that it is technically feasible for me to ground everything in my own eyewash. And I might do something on his position is biblical Unitarianism, so he's not a Trinitarian. So what I've said here is basically like, if you want to say that the rumor is false, that papal infallibility is false, but you also want the Trinity, then the task that you're setting up for yourself is to ground at least enough theology in your own independently worked out systematic theology that you could figure out something like the Trinity on your own without relying on any external authority. Plus, in reality, plus also you probably want divino-human Christology, and you want at least like the 66 books of the Protestant canon that everyone else agrees are canonical too. Like even in the most theologically minimalist or orthodox lowercase o Christian position, it's like you want these. But like the question is, if you want to say the rumor is false, you have to make a technical claim against it. And if it might be the simpler hypothesis is, the greater is its chance of being true. If all you're saying is that the rumor is false for some reason, and I don't know if, papal infallibility is false because of the contradictions in papal teaching or something, or the perceived contradictions. But I don't know that divino-human Christology is true, or Trinitarian theology, or the biblical canon, and I don't even really have any particularly good grounds to assume any of these things. That's one thing. But if you're going to say, well, I am objecting against papal infallibility on the basis of my own theological expertise, and I also believe myself capable of sort of independently reproducing and verifying the conclusions of Trinitarian theology, divino-human Christology, even diothelist, two wills, divino-human Christology, which is what most Christians believe, and the canon of at least 66 books. I'm claiming to be able to do all that on my own, and it's not very likely. Seems like you would need to be able to rest on some authority in order to be able to do that. If you had any chance at all. And but see, the difference with my friend Sam is that he can say, well, you know what, I'm not buying the Trinity, so I don't actually have to, in terms of my own independently worked out systematic theology, it's not as tough of an ask. Maybe he still has to show why the canon is true, or is the 66 books that he believes it is. And maybe it's a little hard to swallow the claim that he could sort of reach these conclusions all on his own without having to presuppose some kind of authority. Hold on. But in any case, one acknowledges that it's not as much of an ask. And plus, there is this way that he can also say, well, regardless of anything else, maybe I can't really claim to super know something like the canon. But that's already dangerous, because to the extent that you acknowledge that your reasons are actually really flimsy, all you can really say is, well, everyone else is in the same boat, which might not be true really. But he might say, but my first obligation nevertheless is to logic, and I perceive the Trinity to be a logically contradictory doctrine. So at a minimum, I'm always guaranteed to be, if I avoid a logically contradictory doctrine, I'm always guaranteed to be more correct than if I hadn't avoided it. Therefore, disagreeing with papal infallibility, which entails Trinitarian theology, it's the dominant strategy. Like, I have to do that in order to maximize my chances of being right. Because I'll always have a better chance of being right by avoiding something incoherent than if I don't. So, my friend can say that. And then, the debate is fundamentally, I suppose, shifting to something else. And I mean, even in a certain sense, if an Orthodox person wants to say, well, I don't really know that the Trinity is true, I just think it's like ever so slightly more likely to be true than not, based on the balance of probabilities. Because you're not just doing logic, you're also trying to interpret the texts, and sometimes the Trinitarian reading makes better sense than the Unitarian reading, arguably, and sometimes it looks like the Unitarian reading, to give Sam credit, looks like it makes better sense, because theology is hard, it's mysterious. I'm not going to be here arguing for Catholicism saying you got to believe it because we're obviously right on all the issues. No, that's not how Catholics can or should argue. So some, even an Orthodox person, big or small o, can say, I'm not totally sold on the Trinity. I just think it ever so slightly more likely than not, but I definitely know that Catholicism's false because of the contradictions in papal teaching, whatever. Well, at a minimum, you are conceding my case that either papal infallibility is true or it's all resting on your own independently worked out systematic theology. That was the purpose of this video's demonstration. The question of whether it's actually technically feasible like you bite the bullet and you say, okay, it all rests on my own independently worked out systematic theology, but it's technically feasible for me to do that, you argue, even if I'm the exception rather than the rule, even if admittedly most people I can't. Well, I happen to be able to do that. Then you can go and debate that. And it's always, one wonders if there's not a way in which every such claim sort of saws off the branch that it's sitting on, because again, something like the canon, or even just any particular book in the canon, like I could ask my friend Sam, how do you, and this is just examples, these aren't absolute gotcha slam dunk questions, these are just examples of questions you could ask, and maybe I'll go further into it or maybe not. Maybe if he wants to have me back on his program, I can go back on. I've changed a lot since I was first on there, and maybe he's evolved to some extent too. But he's remarkably charitable and insanely intelligent. And so he is, and he's insanely knowledgeable on this topic of church fathers and the Trinity and so on, whether you agree with him or not. And I think he's reasonably fair in the way that he approaches the data too, just in terms of my own judgment. But an example of questions I could ask him is like, okay, I'm not even sticking the canon on you. Maybe you don't have to be right about all 66 books. Maybe you just have to sort of be in the ballpark. But how do you know John's gospel is true? And my friend can say, well, most Christians believe in it. And, most Christians believe in the Trinity. Okay, fair. Well, John's gospel is earlier than, say, the Gnostic gospels. And, all of the early Christians tended to believe in it. And I think the earliest Christians had a best chance of being right. Because even though the truth might break down later and be lost, it's more likely to be there in the beginning. But, the operative phrase there is more likely. If God is not a good enough communicator that he can have communicated himself accurately to the majority of believers, it's not necessarily the case that he's a good enough communicator that he will have communicated himself accurately to anyone at all, even the earliest believers. It's kind of an assumption. It's not every book about Jesus that's reliable. A Course in Miracles is a book about Jesus. It's a channeled book. Someone might say, New Age theology makes more sense to me on logical grounds. I think everybody misunderstood Jesus in his time. I think Jesus was saying, I'm God, you're God too. We can all be God, and there is a way that I myself was intellectually seduced by that position. Even if I don't know to what extent I ever bought into it fully, but intellectually it seemed like my struggle wasn't to see that Jesus was God, but it was rather to see the sense in which sort of everyone and everything else is not God, which if you're doing sort of dialectical reasoning about the ultimate reality, even in sort of Langanian terms, because I am heavily influenced by Chris Langan. He's the one who brought me to belief in God intellectually. If you are doing that actually becomes something of a live question. How is it that the infinite is at liberty not to be identical, even strictly logically, with everything? And that's a contradiction, but the infinite is itself a contradiction of both X and not X. You can go down this kind of Alice in Wonderland sort of rabbit hole. And I did, and also, for me personally, in a way that does not carry any weight for anyone else necessarily, I encountered Jesus in a relational way, sort of in spite of myself, in spite of my philosophy at the end of that rabbit hole. And I've talked about that elsewhere too, in my sort of discussion of the first chapter of John's Gospel with my friend Jason on the Almond Tree channel. But anyway, that that's just me. But I'm using this to make a point that one could say, well, I don't think anybody understood Jesus in his time. I think Jesus' point was that everyone is God. It doesn't say in your word, I said that you are gods. If he called them gods to whom the word of God came, why do you say that I blaspheme when I say that I am the Son of God? And there is also a video of me and my friend Jason talking about this, and sort of us leaning heavily into the everything is God sort of pantheist position based on that verse. And it was only later by studying John's gospel more, and even not so like in a scholarly sense, but in a just a different stage of my walk with Jesus. Because it was always a walk with Jesus, even if it was like fraught with heretical error, if you can believe it. I don't feel like it's a fundamentally different Jesus that I know now. I feel like he was always there. I think he's always there for everyone, before they explicitly believe in him or not. But that's just me. You don't have to set any store by that. But later in reading John's gospel, it became apparent to me that particular verse, John 10:35, I want to say, where he harks back to, I want to say, Psalm 82. It's a kal vachomer. It's a light and heavy. It's a rabbinic figure of speech, or sort of logical device where if even the light thing is too heavy, what to speak of the heavy thing? It's an a fortiori. So he's saying, if God called them gods to whom the word of God came, then why do you say that I blaspheme when I, the Son of God, say that I am the Son of God? In other words, when you read John's gospel, Jesus is always holding himself apart from everyone else. He is explicitly claiming a special status for himself. And so he's saying there is even a sense in which you are gods just by receiving the word of God. So why do you say that I blaspheme when I say that I'm the Son of God, given that I am basically as special and different as I am? I think that's actually the way that makes the most sense. You can say theologically you don't buy that, but I think just in terms of reading the text, it makes the most sense. I'm not, mort d'auteur and everything like that. Like, not always that the text means what the most exegetically responsible construction of the text says that it means. I'm not even making that claim. I'm not even going there, but I'm just saying, to me, at least, even just based on the text, that's actually more what it's saying. You can disagree on the theology. But anyway, I could just tell my friend Sam, look, A Course of Miracles says it's about Jesus. I think that's a more authoritative book about Jesus than John's Gospel. Why do you say different? Just, I don't think so many people in his time would have been wrong. Well, I don't know what's so special about that time. I mean, why would you assume that there was something special about that time, but not about later times where everyone else could be wrong? Maybe, it's like, you can never really rule out the chance that he never successfully communicated himself to anyone, that no book on Jesus is reliable, that none of the books of Scripture accurately preserve anything. Who says the Jews, who wrote the Old Testament were accurately preserving their traditions? Matter of fact, if one's first allegiance is to logic, you can find all kinds of logical contradictions in the Gospels. You can find all kinds of discrepancies between the Old Testament and history, and you can say, well, they were not accurately preserving what previously occurred. You can even be Marcionite and say, well, the New Testament, yeah, but Jesus is saying something fundamentally different than the Old Testament. And so the Old Testament's not reliable or trustworthy on anything, even if certain books of the New Testament are. How in the end do you know that any of these books are reliable? It seems like Sam is making an existential or sort of faith-based bet on this book of the Bible that sort of happens to conveniently be bound up into 66 books and widely available now. And almost, he's not this naive, but it is almost, one gets the sense like this thing fortunately happened to drop from heaven. And we don't have to concern ourselves with the question of why and how it got here, or whether all of the books are truly authoritative, or maybe other books are authoritative as well. It just seems to me that whenever you are, that is a thing for which you would really wish there was a reliable authority. And that I don't think you should reasonably hope to be able to get right on your own, because God is not a thing. He's a someone. Therefore, I think really the best thing my friend Sam could say in response to something like that is, well, we're all in the same boat, though. There's going to be that, you're basically having to ground everything in your own perspective too, because you're a thinking person. You're responsible for yourself. You don't get to just outsource that to somebody else. Like if you decide not to decide, you've still made a choice. That's fair. But I can decide to bet against my technical expertise rather than on it. That distinction means everything. I don't think a lot of people are sufficiently aware of to what extent that distinction actually comes in to play in the debate between Catholicism and every other non-Catholic position. Because as I said in the beginning, the desideratum was to not find the patchwork of reasons why every other church happens to be wrong, but to find the one reason, as it were, in virtue of which the true church is right. And I believe that this is it. So, hopefully this was clearly presented. Hopefully somebody gets something out of this. Comments, questions, always welcome. I want to end with prayer. I've come to realize that no matter how much of a, degenerate I am, my prayers actually always have efficacy. That's completely not my doing. It's only His grace. It's a very clear, I realize that more clearly now. So I always pray, even though I'm not spiritually doing so great. And that's why I need y'all's prayer. But I'm going to pray. Father God, in Jesus' name, I pray for everyone who has watched this presentation. I pray that they would be able to enter into the fullness of what you want for their life and the vision that you have for them in their life. And I pray that I would as well. Thank you, Father. Thank you, Jesus. Amen. I pray all this in the name of Jesus. And you as well, my listeners / viewers, I am praying, I'm entreating you to please pray for me, because I need constant prayer. And so thank you for praying for me if you are praying for me. Thank you for watching this presentation.